There is a specific type of silence that haunts you. It is not the silence of a quiet room or a peaceful night, but a hollow resonance inside your own chest. You go through the motions of your life with practiced efficiency. You smile when it is socially appropriate. You pursue the goals you were told would bring satisfaction, the career, the relationships, the status. You have built a life that looks objectively correct, a structure that should, by all accounts, house a happy person. Yet when the distractions fade and you are left alone with your own thoughts, you feel a distinct, terrifying lack of substance. You feel as though you are observing your life through a pane of glass, watching a stranger perform your daily rituals. You tell yourself this is stress. You tell yourself you are just tired. You search for external reasons. Perhaps you need a vacation, a new job, a different partner. But deep down, you know the truth is far more unsettling. The problem isn't the world around you. The problem is the way you exist within it. You are suffering from a friction between who you pretend to be and who you actually are. You are trapped in a cycle of performative existence, terrified that if you stop performing, you will cease to exist. This feeling of fraudulent emptiness is not unique to you, nor is it a sign of mental defect. It is according to the analytical psychology of Carl Jung, the first tremor of an awakening. It is the psyche screaming that the contract you signed with society is no longer valid. Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist who mapped the darkest corners of the human soul, suggested that this suffering is not an obstacle to your life, but the very mechanism of it. We live in an age that pathologizes pain. We view anxiety, melancholy, and existential dread as malfunctions, glitches in the biological machine that must be medicated, distracted, or optimized away. We treat the symptom so we can get back to work, but Jung proposed a radical, terrifying alternative. There is no coming to consciousness without pain. Consider the weight of that statement. It implies that the comfort you desperately seek is actually the enemy of your growth. It suggests that the neurosis you are trying to cure is actually an attempt by your self-regulating psyche to heal you. You are in pain because you are waking up. To become conscious, to truly see yourself and the world, is not a serene process of floating into the light. It is a violent act. It is a tearing of the veil. It requires the systematic destruction of the illusions you have used to survive since childhood. To understand why this process must be painful, we must first look at the architecture of the prison you have built for yourself. Jung called this the persona. The persona is the mask you wear to interface with the world. It is the good employee, the dutiful child, the intellectual, the peacemaker. It is a necessary tool for social survival. It allows you to navigate the complexities of human interaction without being exposed. The tragedy, however, begins when you forget that you are wearing a mask. You begin to believe that you are the role you play. This is known as identification with the persona. When you identify with the mask, you must necessarily reject everything about yourself that does not fit the character. If your persona is the nice guy, you must repress your aggression. If your persona is the rational thinker, you must repress your emotions. If your persona is the saint, you must repress your sexuality. Where do these rejected parts of you go? They do not vanish. They are shoved into the unconscious, into what Jung called the shadow. The shadow contains all the untamed, primitive, and unacceptable parts of your nature. But it also contains your vitality, your creativity, and your power. By clinging to the safety of your persona, you split yourself in half. You become a two-dimensional cutout, a polite fiction, while the real substance of your soul festers in the dark. The pain you are feeling right now, that vague, hovering anxiety, is the pressure of the shadow pushing against the walls of the persona. It is the unlived life seeking expression. The psyche is a self-regulating system. It seeks wholeness, or what Jung called individuation. When you deny your shadow to maintain your social mask, you create an imbalance so severe that the psyche induces suffering to force you to pay attention. This is why the suffering feels like a death. In a way, it is. For you to become who you are meant to be, the person you are right now must die. The seemingly stable identity you have spent decades constructing must be dismantled. Jung observed that people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls. They will practice virtue until it makes them sick. They will chase money until they are hollow. They will numb themselves with substances or endless entertainment. Why? Because facing the soul means facing the shadow. And facing the shadow is a humiliation. It requires you to admit that you are not as good, as smart, or as in control as you thought you were. Most people stop here. They feel the initial sting of this psychological friction, and they retreat. They double down on the persona. They become rigid, dogmatic, and bitter. Jung called this regressive restoration of the persona. It is a retreat into the womb of unconsciousness. But you are here because the retreat is no longer working. The old tricks have failed. You are standing at the threshold, looking into the abyss of your own complexity, and you are terrified. This terror is necessary. It signifies that you are moving from a state of participation mystique, an unconscious identity, with the collective crowd toward individual consciousness. But this journey is not a singular event. It is a descent. Jungian analysis suggests that this painful coming to consciousness manifests in distinct stages, each bringing its own specific type of suffering. Recognizing which stage you are currently enduring is the first step toward integrating the pain, rather than being consumed by it. The first stage of this painful realization is often the collision with the realization of betrayal. Not necessarily betrayal by others, but the betrayal of self. You realize that the rules you followed were lies. You were told that if you were polite, worked hard, and suppressed your darker impulses, you would be rewarded with happiness. You realize now that the world does not care about your mask. This realization usually manifests as a crisis of meaning. The things that used to bring you joy, your hobbies, your achievements, your social standing, suddenly taste like ash. This is the dissolution of the persona. It is painful because it leaves you feeling naked and vulnerable. You feel as though you have lost your skin. Without the rigid structure of your social role, you don't know who you are. You look in the mirror and see a stranger. This is the moment of greatest danger, but also of greatest potential. Jung warned that when the persona dissolves, the unconscious contents can flood the conscious mind. If you do not have a container for this experience, you can fall into a state of disorientation or depression. But if you can withstand the heat of this dissolution, you prepare yourself for the encounter with the shadow. This is where the true work begins, and where the pain shifts from a dull ache of emptiness to a sharp, acute confrontation with reality. You are no longer sleepwalking. You are waking up on the operating table. The surgeon, however, is you, and the organ being removed is your innocence. This marks the second and perhaps most visceral stage of suffering, the withdrawal of projections. This is the moment you realize that the demons you have been fighting in the world are actually reflections of your own face. For years you have likely navigated your life by identifying enemies. You have pointed fingers at the tyrant boss, the manipulative partner, the corrupt politician, or the lazy colleague. You have felt a sense of righteous indignation when observing their flaws. This moral superiority is a drug. It reassures you that you are good because they are bad. Jung identified this mechanism as projection. When you refuse to acknowledge a trait within yourself, be it greed, aggression, lust, or laziness, you do not destroy it. You cast it out, projecting it onto the people around you, like a movie projector casting an image onto a blank screen. You hate in others what you cannot accept in yourself. Coming to consciousness requires you to retract these projections, and this process is agonizing. It requires you to admit that the tyranny you hate in your father exists in your own heart. It requires you to admit that the manipulation you despise in your lover is a mirror of your own passive-aggressive tendencies. Jung described this realization as a crushing burden. He noted that when a person realizes that the evil is not out there but in here, they lose their footing. You can no longer play the victim. You can no longer blame your circumstances. You are forced to own your shadow. This is a humiliation. The ego, your small conscious sense of self, thrives on being the hero of the story. But to integrate the shadow, the ego must be dethroned. You must accept that you are capable of betrayal, of cruelty, of profound selfishness. This is not a call to act on these impulses, but to acknowledge their presence. The pain you feel in this stage is the burning away of your self-righteousness. It is the death of the beautiful soul that believes it is harmless. As Jung famously said, "I would rather be whole than good." But to be whole, you must first admit that you are in part bad. If you survive the encounter with the shadow, without retreating into denial, you enter the third stage of suffering the tension of opposites. This is the crux of the Jungian path to individuation. Most people want a resolution to their internal conflict. They want the anxiety to go away so they can feel peace. They view the conflict between their duty and their desire, or their intellect and their emotion, as a problem to be solved. You want one side to win. You want to kill the desire to be safe, or you want to kill the duty to be free. Jung argues that this desire for resolution is a trap. Consciousness is born not from the victory of one side, but from the endurance of the conflict. You must hold the tension. You must stand in the center of the fire, where your opposing nature clashes. You are both a creature of instinct and a creature of spirit. You are both a saint and a sinner. You want safety, yet you crave danger. To come to consciousness is to stretch your arms out and hold these paradoxes without letting them tear you apart. This state is often experienced as a suspension of life, a stagnation where nothing moves. You feel stuck. You cannot go back to the unconscious ignorance of your past, but you cannot see a way forward. Jung compared this to a crucifixion. The ego is nailed to the cross of its own conflicting nature. This is suffering in its purest form because it feels meaningless. It feels like static torture. But Jung believed that if you can hold this tension long enough, without running away into distraction or addiction, a third thing emerges. The psyche produces a transcendent function, a new symbol, a new way of being that unites the opposites in a way your logic could never predict. But the stakes of refusing this pain are catastrophic. It is critical that you understand what happens if you turn back now. You might ask, why should I endure this? Why not just stay asleep? The answer lies in the distinction Jung made between legitimate suffering and neurotic suffering. Legitimate suffering is the pain of growth. It is the fire that burns the wood to create heat. It changes you. Neurotic suffering, however, is a cycle. It is the pain of running away from pain. If you refuse to face your shadow, if you refuse to dismantle your persona, you do not escape suffering. You merely trade the sharp, meaningful pain of transformation for the dull, rotting pain of stagnation. Jung observed that when a person refuses to individuate the unlived life, turns against them. The energy that should have gone into your growth turns into a demon. This manifests as fate. You will find yourself in the same toxic relationship, over and over again with different faces. You will find yourself hitting the same professional wall decade after decade. You will feel a growing sense of sterility, a wasteland in your soul where nothing grows. This is the neurosis Jung spoke of. It is the result of avoiding the legitimate suffering of being human. You become possessed by the things you ignore. If you ignore your aggression, you will become passive-aggressive and resentful, sabotaging your own success while smiling politely. If you ignore your need for meaning, you will fall into a nihilistic depression that no amount of pleasure can cure. The ultimate price of unconsciousness is a life that is not lived but merely endured. You become a puppet of your own unconscious complexes, dancing on strings you refuse to see. Therefore, the question is not how to avoid pain, but which pain you will choose. Will you choose the pain of the wound that heals, or the pain of the wound that festers? If you are still listening, you have likely made your choice. You are willing to endure the fire, but how do you do it? How do you navigate this dissolution without losing your mind? Jung's method was not about fixing the self, but about shifting the very seat of your consciousness. The solution lies in the shift from being the experiencer of the emotion to being the observer of it. This brings us to the practical application of integration. You must learn to treat your own psyche as an objective phenomenon. When a wave of despair or rage or anxiety hits you, the instinct is to say, I am sad or I am angry. You identify with the affect. You become the emotion. Jung suggests a subtle but powerful linguistic and psychological shift. I observe that sadness is present. This is not dissociation. You are not numbing yourself. You are feeling the emotion fully, but you are not drowning in it. You are standing on the bank of the river, watching the water rush by. This is the beginning of what Jung called active imagination and the dialogue with the self. You stop regarding your intrusive thoughts as enemies and start treating them as messengers. When the anxiety keeps you awake at 3:00 a.m., instead of fighting it, you ask it, what do you want? What are you trying to tell me that I am refusing to hear? You personify the symptom. You give it a voice. You realize that your anxiety is perhaps a furious inner child who has been neglected, or a creative spirit that is being suffocated by your boring job. By engaging with the symptom, you honor the psyche. You stop trying to cure yourself of your own humanity. and start trying to understand the teleology of your suffering, the purpose it serves. This acceptance changes the texture of your life. You begin to understand that the goal of this painful journey was never to achieve a state of permanent bliss or to eliminate all conflict. The goal was wholeness. Jung used the image of the mandala to describe this state, a circle with a center. For most of your life, you have lived on the periphery, tossed around by the chaotic winds of circumstance and emotion. You believed your ego, that small, anxious voice in your head, was the center of the universe. The pain you have been feeling is the destruction of that delusion. It is the painful gravity pulling you toward the true center, which Jung called the self. The self is the totality of your being, both conscious and unconscious, light and dark. To live in service of the self is to surrender the ego's demand for control. It is to accept that you are a vessel for forces much larger than your social identity. This is the ultimate integration. You stop projecting your sadness, your anger, and your fear. Instead, you invite them to the table. You recognize that your depression is not a malfunction, but a demand for rest and depth. You recognize that your anxiety is not a weakness, but a heightened sensitivity to the dangers of living falsely. You become an alchemist of your own soul. In the ancient tradition of alchemy, which Jung studied extensively, the great work was the transmutation of lead into gold. Jung saw this as the perfect metaphor for psychological development. The lead is your heavy, burdened, unconscious state, the very depression and heaviness you feel right now. The gold is not material wealth, but the luminous quality of a consciousness that has integrated its own darkness. But the crucial lesson of alchemy is that you cannot have the gold without the lead. You cannot have the resurrection without the crucifixion. The substance must be heated, dissolved, and blackened before it can be purified. Your suffering is that heat. Therefore, do not wish for a life without pain. To wish for that is to wish for unconsciousness. It is to wish to be a child again, swaddled in the ignorance of the garden before the fall. But you have eaten the apple. You know too much now to go back. The only way is through. As you integrate these shattered pieces of yourself, you will notice a quiet strength emerging. It is not the loud, brittle confidence of the persona, which needs constant validation to survive. It is a grounded, somber solidity. You become less reactive. You are no longer easily possessed by the moods of others or the hysteria of the crowd. You have seen your own darkness, so the darkness of the world no longer terrifies you. You have felt the capacity for evil in your own heart, so you can look upon the evils of the world with understanding, rather than just judgment. You become, in a word, real. This is the evolution of consciousness. It is a lonely path, for few are willing to pay the price of admission. Most will stay on the surface, distracted by the flickering lights of the cave, terrified of the shadows. But you have chosen to turn around and face the fire. So if you feel broken today, if you feel the weight of the world pressing down on your chest, do not despair. Do not medicate the symptom away without asking what it knows. This pressure is necessary. It is the pressure of the diamond forming in the dark. It is the growing pains of a soul that has become too large for the small life you were living. Carl Jung did not promise that this process would make you happy in the way the world defines happiness. He promised something far more valuable. He promised that it would make your life meaningful. He promised that you would no longer be a leaf blowing in the wind, but a tree with roots reaching deep into hell and branches reaching high into heaven. The pain is not a sign that you are failing. It is a sign that you are breaking open. And it is only through the cracks that the light of consciousness can finally enter.